What's going on, y'all? Welcome to another episode of Radical Math Talk, the show for the revolutionaries in math education. I'm your host, Sarfo-Mensah. And as always, if you are coming on to this podcast and listening for the very first time, I welcome you and I hope that you return after this episode, which I know you'll like, for future episodes and more content. And if you're a returning listener or viewer of the podcast, as always, I welcome you back, and I hope that today's episode is one that you find informative, enlightening, and of course, insightful. So, before we introduce our newest guest, just a reminder, if you are tuning in from YouTube, make sure you hit that red subscribe button if you love what you see. This will allow you to get future notifications for new episodes of this podcast. Of course, if you're listening through audio with Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you listen to your podcast, make sure you subscribe on those platforms as well. And then, of course, for those who have been inquiring about how to contribute monetarily to the growth of this podcast, we do accept donations through Cash App and Venmo. So if you are on Cash App or have it on your phone, you can hit up our handle, which is $ID Talk for Ed. And then if you're on Venmo, our handle is at KWAMESM. That's at KwameSM. And then to catch previous episodes of the podcast, you can either visit our YouTube channel, which is under my name, Kwame Sarfo-Mensah, or you can go to our official website, which is identitytalkforeducators.com. Thank you all for your support, those who have been continuing to watch and listen to our podcast. It's always greatly appreciated. So today's episode, we're talking about obviously math, but we're talking about it through the lens of our Black and brown students. Obviously, when we look at math education and just math learning in general, there are different ways in which that is manifested in the classroom. And one thing that has come to light, especially in recent years through research and other content, is that the way our Black and brown students learn math, process math, um, it's different than how it's traditionally taught. You have to do it in a way that speaks to the culture, in a way that speaks to them and allows them to be engaged so that they can access it in a real authentic way. And that's something that isn't talked about enough. Even though there's growing conversation around it, there's still more conversation that needs to be had. And this is why we wanted to talk about just this issue of anti-Blackness in math education and ways in which we can combat it and really make it more authentic for our learners. So to help us with this conversation, I want to bring on a brother who's doing some phenomenal work in this area. And yeah, I'm just excited to have him on. So I don't want to waste too much more time. So let's bring on the good brother, Dr. Nickolaus Ortiz, to the podcast to talk with us about his journey, his work in academia as it relates to math education, and how we can really combat this anti-Blackness issue that we're still dealing with in our math classroom. So let's bring Dr. Ortiz on for this conversation. What's going on, brother?
What's up, y'all? What's up? What's up? So glad to be here.
Yes, sir. It's an honor to have you on, man. How you feel?
I feel good, man. Life is good. I feel like I'm in a good place. I'm happy to be with y'all, you and your podcast this time around, man. And yeah, all is well. All is well.
Yes, sir. So on this podcast, we have three segments that we like to cover. The first segment is what we call our mathography. So all of us math lovers, we have a story, a personal story that speaks to our relationship with math, how we first encountered math in our lives, how we've grown with math and evolved with it over time, and how it still stays with us to this very day. So I want to give you an opportunity to just share your story of how you've come to love math and why you still continue to love it as evidence of the work that you're doing.
Mm. Yeah, man. Yeah, I think that's always an important place to start, right? Like it's kind of, and I love this word, bro. Like mathography. That's just kind of sitting with me. I might have to use that in my own conversations now.
Yes, sir. By all means.
Yeah, man. But yeah, I feel like this could be a really long story, or this could be a really short story, you know. But I think part of where I start, right, like, is that I think there was always um just some conversation about, right, like me kind of being like a very gifted child, or right, like being very knowledgeable in mathematics, right? I think I always heard that. But what I also heard in that conversation, or in that narrative, was that it almost seemed like there was somewhat of an anomaly for that to be happening, right? Not only were
Mhm.
people like telling me that I was like really good at math, but it was like it was almost like it was a shock to them, right? Like, and I think that always kind of really gauged the way that I knew there was something interesting, but I didn't have the language for it, like when I was growing up, right? Like I think
Mhm.
um it was very present, but I think I just, like I said, I didn't know, um I didn't have the language for it all the time, right? I think yeah, like we moved around a lot of times, a lot of different times, like kind of growing up. I went to a lot of different elementary schools, a lot of different middle schools, a lot of different high schools, all within the metro Atlanta area. But like just for various reasons, right? Like just being enrolled in different places. But each time, right, like there was always like kind of this, at least eventually, right, like I would be here like, oh, this boy is real smart, this kid is real smart, all these different things, right? Like, and it's very interesting as I kind of was enrolled in different schools that had different demographics, right? Like what that looked like
Yeah.
to be like in a totally black school, that like, oh, you're coming in being like this really smart black kid, and also what that meant to be in like really white schools, like coming in as like this really gifted math student. um so yeah, like that was always a part of it. I'll also say, right, like that I think within my trajectory of math learning, like black women in particular were always very present in my lives, and kind of helping to cultivate this math genius, if you will, right? Like I've always had a lot of black women teachers, and they were definitely some of the ones that like took on more hats than just the I'm just here to get a check, right? Like
Yep.
it was very much, right, like a pouring into, a mentoring, right? Like, and I think that made the difference in the way that I experienced mathematics, right? Like, and I think that always was something that I'm like, I have to take that into my own teaching, and when I interact with children. Just to kind of give a bit of that, right? I remember eighth grade, Miss Allen, right? Like she was this black woman teacher that I was taking in algebra. Um, because I was again on this advanced track taking algebra in the eighth grade, and one of the things that I just remember about Miss Allen was, right, she had this group of black students coming up to the school on Saturdays to
Yep.
learn. You know what I'm saying? And it was like for no other reason, right? Like we didn't get any accolades out of it, right? Nothing else. It was just like, like if y'all are going to be prepared, right? Like I don't have enough time to really get this done within our current trajectory, right? Like, so y'all got to come on these Saturdays, and that was it, right? Like, it wasn't like a penalty, right? Like, it was nothing else she could really do. It was just like we were that motivated to learn from Miss Allen that she had a group of black students coming up to the school on a Saturday, and it was like
Wow.
there was something that was so rich just about that, and that we knew, right? Like that she helped us to learn to love it for ourselves. We were doing it for her, but then we were also doing it because it meant a lot for what came next in our lives, right? Like, and she helped us to kind of to explore that and to kind of take that on, right? And I think about even like my high school teacher, right? I always like I'm having this conversation and this black
Right.
woman, right? Like this black woman teacher, and like we having this conversation. And I'm telling her that, yeah, I just want to be lazy during my senior year. I don't want to take AP calculus, I want to have this senioritis. I want to chill. I'm thinking
Right.
she's listening. We're having this conversation. When I tell y'all, the next day I walked into her class, she had a brand new schedule fixed for me, and she said, "You're taking AP calculus," and it was like at that point I can't even argue. It's like it's like she knew that I had the ability to do it. I think there was a lot of it though was just I didn't I didn't always believe in myself, right? Like, but I think she saw something in me um, that again I was still trying to place my finger on, and she kind of helped me to realize that. So that was beautiful. I thank God definitely for teachers like that, because I think it makes a world of difference. Like when you have that as you're growing up, because I say one of the last big moments in my just my trajectory. I've been teaching for about I taught high school for about 4 years before going back and doing my PhD. And I had
Okay.
this one professor, man. Like I needed to take a math content course so I could, be have enough graduate level credits to be able to teach at a community college. So I was going back like during my PhD. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna pick up this one extra graduate level math course so I could teach at the community college just if I want to, right?
Sure.
And man, I never forget, man, this white woman professor that I had, she said, I told you at the beginning of this class that I didn't think that you had the mathematical background to be taking my course. And it was like, dang, man, like, in that moment, right? Like, she caused me to doubt everything that had been poured into me up until that point, right? Like, all the work
Wow.
that those teachers had poured into me, even the fact that I had already been teaching for so long, you know what I'm saying? It was like, dang, am I really supposed to be here? And part of the reason that I do this work, right, like, is because I wonder about what happens if that would have been my teacher back in middle school or back in high school.
Wow.
How
Come
different would
on.
my trajectory have been if those types of teachers are at that level, and how often, right? Like some black kids don't have the blessing to have the same type of teachers that I had, and they get that teacher, right? Like, and so how different is their trajectory because of that? So again, I could keep going, but I think those are like some of the main moments within my mathography, right?
Yeah, those are some major moments. So just going back for a second, you spoke on the maternal instinct of those math teachers you had in high school, and
Mm,
the fact that you still had doubt in your abilities, even though you are traveling along this trajectory of being this gifted student all throughout K to 12, but yet you still had the doubt in your mind. And then you go into these grad level courses, and then you have this white woman professor pretty much saying that you didn't have the requisite mathematical background to take her course,
mm,
but you are somebody who is throughout your entire educational career, just as a student, you've always excelled in math. And then yet you have this white woman saying that. Now, when she said that, what gave her that idea, or that to think that, oh, you can't handle my course? Just,
mm.
oh, you just a black man, you can't do this course. I could just tell. Or was there some sufficient data? I just want to just paint the picture for our audience so they
Yeah,
understand the
man.
depths of what you're saying.
Yeah, like because I went to her, like, and I asked her what made her say that, and she was saying that
Yeah,
she was like, well, I looked at your transcript, but it was crazy because this was the intro class to this was an intro class, their intro class to graduate level work. But what was crazy was like I said, I had already taken 15 hours of graduate level math. You know what I'm saying? And it
sure.
was and so, then my question was like, is that commonplace for you to go look at all your students' transcripts? I was like, that seems like that's a lot of work to be going.
For
And you
real.
know what I'm saying? Like for
Yeah.
you to even pull up the transcript or to go the work of finding that student's transcript, right? Like when, you know what I'm saying, like you weren't doing any advising. It was just, and I think the only thing that prompted her to do that was because, one of the things I had always learned from from my teachers, right? One of the mentoring strategies they had always told me, they were like, make good connections with your professors. You know what I'm saying? Like if you like, you need to make sure like your college professors, um, like they know you by name, right? Like you're going to their office,
Hmm.
right? Like you're building you're building community with them.
Of
That way, like they
course.
know who you are. You know what I'm saying? And so I have always taken that very literally, right? Like so my professors used to always know me. And so like I used to do the same thing with her, right? Like I would go to her office a lot of times, but I'd be like, hey, I'm working on this problem. I was looking at this. And so that's what prompted her to say that because again, right? Like and what's interesting, and I know we're not getting into some of the research just yet, right? But the way, right, like that we think about like how Black students navigate, particularly like higher education spaces, right? Like so, part of what I had learned as like a navigational capital, right? Like how do you? Part of what had always been told to me by my mentors was how do I interact with professors? So the way that I had learned to navigate, right, like post secondary environments was clearly like something that she disapproved of, right? Like she was like, "Why are you coming to my
Mm,
office this much? And why are you trying to
uh-huh.
have this many conversations with me?" And it was like, it wasn't that I couldn't do it. It was the fact that, right, like I had always learned that I'm supposed to be in constant communication with you, right? Like so there
Right.
was like that tension between what does this look like? How does this really get taken up? And like how that even caused her to doubt my ability to be able to do it. So it was interesting, man. It was interesting.
That's really interesting because what's so weird is if you weren't a brother, right,
Mm, mm,
and you were doing the same thing, my guess is that they wouldn't have had that interpretation
mm,
of you coming to the office hours asking questions because that's something that good students do.
mhm, mhm,
At
mhm.
least that's what I was taught. You
Exactly,
know, if
man.
you're a student and you're in the lecture hall, you have no idea what the professor's saying. They're the ones who encourage you to go to the office hours. There's a reason why office hours are available.
Mhm,
So if you're going there, it's not even so much a case of you're incapable of doing the work or you're struggling. Sometimes it just might be, no, I want to kick it with the professor because
exactly.
I'm trying to
Exactly.
show them that I'm invested and I'm interested in what their class is and what
Mhm.
they're doing.
Mhm. And that's what I think the disconnect was, right? Like, cause I said the same thing, brother. Like, you know what
Yeah.
I'm saying? Like, even like I remember there were times where some of like my really strong math students when I was teaching high school, they would come to tutorial just to finish up their homework in tutorial, right? Like they were having conversation with me. They really didn't need that much help on their work, right? Like, but they would, as they're kind of working, they're asking questions, like we're laughing, we're talking, right? Like it was building community around like the teaching and learning of mathematics. And that's
Yeah.
what made mathematics that much less intimidating, to which I think she did not connect all of that. And it was like, it was very much like a slap in the face, right? Like that, dang, like again, there's a tension here that she isn't aware of, right? Like, but we've been socialized around what it means to be a mathematics person very differently.
Mm, true. And then when I look at my undergrad experience, so I was a math major at Temple University. Shout out to Temple University, Philly in the building, right?
Hey, Philly.
And during the time that I was doing undergrad, whenever you went into a classroom for a math course, I would either be the only black person in there or one of a few. I didn't have any black math professors in my 5 years of undergrad. None. They were either, white or Asian. That was it. Did no black, no Latinx professors. And I always found myself trying to find community with, you know, my black classmates, whoever
Mhm.
they were. I try to befriend them and we just, work together to try to get through these classes.
Definitely.
But I always think to myself, if I just had black professors in a few of them, not every class, but in a few of those courses,
All right.
I definitely
At
would have
least
fared
one, man.
better.
At least one.
At least one, I would have fared better during my
Yeah.
undergrad years because, man, when I say it was real, struggle was real. Like, but
Yeah.
I don't want to go into details with all that because I want to make sure we focus on you. So during your undergrad, you had a good amount of black professors, or was it kind of a diverse mix?
So during undergrad, let me
Yeah.
think. Um, so the way my degree was set up, right? Like I was in math education. So my degree, we took a lot of the same courses that the math students would take, right? Like, but then I also took education classes, right? Like, so my senior
Got it.
year, like I was taking education, particularly in math education courses, and so I had a few more black professors, particularly within the college of education. Within
Mm.
the college, within like the math department, I'm trying to remember. I'm trying to think back, man. I really, I don't think within the math department I had. If I had any, none are standing out. Yeah, I don't think I did. Not in the
Yeah,
math
man.
department itself. Nah.
Hmm.
Mm-mm.
Interesting, interesting.
Yeah.
But we'll definitely get more into that as we move on to this next segment. So show your work, right? These are the three most popular words you'll hear out of any math teacher's mouth. Show your work. You're bringing up some work to get graded for your teacher. They check it. They see that there's what they deem as a lack of evidence, a lack of mathematical thinking. They're going to tell you, I'm going to need you to show your work so I can see how you're thinking about this skill, how you're thinking about this content. I need to know that you really understand. And that's just something that we've been conditioned to do given our math learning experience. It's always about that answer, and that always trumped the process that we took to get to the answer.
Mm.
And it's something that still even goes on to this very day. But in the context of this podcast, when we say show your work, this is about your receipts. It's about the receipts. And in this case, we're talking about the work that you're doing with regard to how we can improve the learning experiences of black and brown students in the math classroom, which is something that's been of a major focus in your research and the work that you're doing. So to just get started, um, you are a doctor,
That's what.
and we got to put some respect on that, as a black man. But I want to give you a chance to just share, and maybe the clip notes version, because there's so much more we got to cover, of what the experience was navigating those waters in academia. What are those ups and downs when you're going through that journey of getting that degree?
mm, mm. You think I'm very pensive sometimes, so give me a second just to think.
Take your time.
I hmm.
And if you're still with whatever university and this is a question that you can't answer, I respect that as well. Cause I want to make sure you keep your job, brother. So
Hey, listen. I think sometimes they need to hear it though. But no, I'm not with that university.
cool. Just making sure.
Mm, I think, man. I think one of the I don't know, man. I think yeah, I think it was just I, the best way to kind of explain it, right? It was just a learning experience, and I think
Okay.
there was so much of it. Like where I was, black people were only, I think, at most, I want to say like 3.6% of the population, which it was a really big school. So it was like you really felt that 3.6%, right? Like, and I think um that really that really made a difference, right? Like coming from Atlanta, where like I was very much socialized around like just a lot of black people, right? Like
Yeah.
my high school was like 99% black. You know what I'm saying? Like the school I taught in was like 99% black. And it's just like being like just very being very much in like these Black spaces for so long, right? There was, I think maybe that was a part that I was kind of missing, was right, like um just being around enough Black people, right? Like I think that was like I definitely felt that. I think just even outside of like the schooling context, right? Like so I'm mind you, right? Like I'm leaving Atlanta to go to this place, the school, right? Like to kind of be to get this degree, right? Like, so there's things you give up like during that, right? Like so you
Of
give up, a
course.
lot of times you give up like comfortability, right? Like
Hmm.
I grew up, like I'm a church kid, right? Like I grew up in the church. Um One of the things that was like a really big thing for me, right? Like was that it was like, how do I stay grounded, right? Like in like my Christianity in a place, right? Like that has a totally different church, right? Like I don't even have like a traditional Black church, right? Like to attend, right? Like so
Sure,
it's like
sure.
when these things get difficult at school, how then do I kind of still, you know, kind of navigate them, kind of deal with them in a way where, right, like my support system now has shifted or has changed, right? Like, so I think that was a part of it. I think another part of it was just that, when you call back home, right? Like I'm the first of my grandmother's grandchildren that's doing a PhD. You know what I'm
Oh
saying? Like,
wow.
and there's
Yeah,
a
that's big.
th- yeah, yeah, man. Like, not too many of us like are college graduates in general. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, I'm calling home. I'm talking, to my mom, to my family, to my siblings, right? Like, and just kind of saying, right, like how difficult some of these moments are, right? Like, and they're like, you smart, you gonna get it, it's gonna be all right. You know what I'm saying? Which is comforting, but it's like there's a level. I think what was maybe like a difficulty was that I couldn't find the words to communicate to them necessarily the the kind of, to some degree, right, like some of the turmoil, right, like that the PhD puts you through, right? Like so like it was like, I'm kind of, I'm bent into them, right? Like, but like when you're not able to fully describe all of what you're feeling, all of what you're kind of going through, right? Like because they're just unfamiliar, So I think
Sure.
that was a tension for me, right? Like and that they really just didn't like I couldn't communicate it as well, So I think that part, right? Like, and I think um kind of going to some of the ups though, right? Like I did find my community, right? Like I was president of the Black Graduate Students Association at my undergrad institution, um, which was also, right. Like so, it was interesting to some degree because when I was doing my doctoral work, right, like this was around the time of Mike Brown and some other folks kind of
Wow,
getting
man.
killed. You know what I'm saying? Like so
Yeah.
that being like very much some tension around the university, right? Like and then also, right, like I'm in Texas at the heart of Donald Trump getting like going on his campaign trail and then getting elected, right? Like so it was very much right, like how do you kind of grapple and kind of internalize some of these things that are happening out there, but I still have to write a dissertation. You know what I'm saying? It's like how do
Hmm.
I wrap my head around all of this? And how do I still feel safe, like in the
That's
midst of
right.
all of this, right? So I think that was a part of it. But like I said, like I was able to find some community, so I appreciate that. And again, I had some folks, right? Like I think part of what PhD and doctoral work kind of helped to introduce me to was like some really close colleagues and really close friends that um I think you find your crew of other Black like academics that are kind of going through some of the same stuff, right? Like so they kind of understood what I was going through, and we also supported each other, right? Like it was like a peer mentoring type of thing, right? Like, so
Hmm.
that was a part of the beauty in doing this, right? Like it's like, man, now, like even the grant that I have now, right? Like is that um four of them I met during doctoral work. You know what I'm saying? So it's
Wow.
like
Yeah.
it's like it's such a beautiful thing in that regard. But yeah, I think just something a bit more maybe like tangible to the program. I think what I had to learn, right? that my work is very specific towards thinking about like what teaching and learning means for Black children, right? And I think there was a part of me that was kind of scared or timid about that for a while, right? Like it was like, oh man, people are gonna call me racist, or people are gonna, like say these different things, right? Like, but I
Sure.
had to kind of reconcile this idea that, right, like there's so much that we still don't know about what is going on with these children and learning with mathematics, right? And there's still so much work to undo, like some of the deficit narratives that people put out about Black children in learning mathematics, right?
Right.
Like so, I'm like, this is the work that is necessary, right? Like so, there was a there was that, and yeah, man, like I'll pause there, but like those are some like the big things, like just like as you mentioned, like some of the ups and downs throughout the program, but yeah.
Yeah, I know there's so much there. But you did mention this new project that you're working on. And I think it's through the National Science Foundation, if I'm correct, right?
It is.
Yes. And let me make sure I get this title right. So the title of this project is focusing on examining Blackness in post-secondary STEM education through a multidimensional, multiplicative lens. So that is a mouthful. So for our audience who may not be in that academia realm, can you
Mhm.
break it down exactly what the focus of the project is and what do you and your team of scholars and colleagues hope to accomplish with this project?
Yeah, man, I appreciate you for reading the name out, because I was like, let me let me get all the words to it again. It's still so fresh, still so new. Nah, but yeah, it's a beautiful just endeavor, right? Like,
Yes.
and pretty much what we wanted to look at, right? Like it was kind of born out of this idea, right? Like that a lot of times, right? People will kind of read Black people in particular, right, like it's being very monolithic, right? Like it's like, well,
Hmm.
we understand Black students are struggling with STEM education, right? Like so let's just give them this one set of tools. But I think part of what we want to look at, right, like is like how do we nuance Blackness in a way that says, right, like that all Black people are not going to require or going to need the same things to be able to navigate STEM environments or STEM majors,
Yes.
right? So it's like when we talk about like this multiplicative lens, right? Like what we're really looking at, right? Like is how then do maybe like Black people who grew up in the US, right? Like so who we might think of like who have always grown up in the States versus like in their at a post-secondary level, right? Like in their majoring in engineering, how then might that differ from somebody that still identifies as Black, right? But most of their upbringing is Nigeria. It's from Nigeria, right? Like
Hmm.
how then do we think about, right, like those how they're socialized in many of the same ways, but also there's some nuances in the ways that they understand their Blackness and understand navigating these aspects of this, right? And then I think we're also trying to look at, right, like how do they also understand their Blackness within these environments, right? Like in what ways do they have they come to understand particularly, right, like what it means to be what it means to be African American, what it means to be Afro Latinx, what it means to be, right, like biracial within this context, or like how do all of these things that still fall on this idea of Blackness impact the way that they're socialized and impact the things that we say, how we theorize around what policy that we need to put in place for these students. So that's what the project is really looking at, is like how do we um, kind of make sense around that. And so I'm heading up the site here in Georgia. But my colleagues are also I have colleagues in Texas, have colleagues in Chicago, colleagues in the DC area, right? Like so because and part of the intention around that, right, like is that we know even Blackness looks different regionally, right? Like
Yes,
the
it
way
does.
that ATL Blackness looks from like
Hmm.
North Carolina Blackness or a Texas Blackness might be radically different, right? So we're trying to look into all these different spaces and kind of really nuance and theorize around those types of things.
Oh man, I love it, man. I love it. And I like the fact that you're looking at this through an intersectional lens.
Hmm. Hmm.
Because you're talking about blackness, and we know that with blackness, it comes in different shades, different textures. I could think about my own experience. I actually spent part of my K-12 schooling in Ghana,
Oh, dope, dope.
going to school there. And I could tell you the level of math that I was doing out there during
Mm.
my seventh, eighth, and ninth grade years was at a higher level than what I would have done if I had done my schooling in the States during those grades.
And you hear that so much, right? Like I hear that so much, right? Like
Oh,
that.
it's real.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And so it's like, dang, like, and I think that in turn, right, like impacts the way that they feel, whether or not, like, when you ask Black students, did they feel like they were prepared once they got to college, right? Like, it's like some of them say yes, right? Like some of them say no, right? Like, well, what happens when you start nuancing who is saying yes to this and who is saying no, and like about like where their K-12 schooling kind of came from, you know?
Right.
And so it's very intriguing. I think it allows us to ask some really dope questions, and to be able to theorize in some really beautiful ways.
Yeah. And I think then that's one aspect. And then with regard to family dynamics, I come from a
Mm,
household where both my parents are college educated. You know,
mm,
my father graduated with the MBA, has a
right.
strong math background. He was an actuary.
Okay,
My
okay.
mom also had a strong math background, even though she was studying nursing, but I was exposed to that. And then we look at other people in my family, like my older brother, he's in aerospace engineering. So
Mm,
math has always been something that's been within my family. But then if you go to other Black households, that may not be the makeup of that family.
mhm, mhm,
So
mhm.
the math experience or the orientation to math is going to be drastically different just based on that alone.
Yeah.
So I know there are so many other aspects of it that you have to factor in.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we're looking forward to exploring all of those, man, or as much as we can. Right? Like, because we know family, right? Like those tend to be like a huge support system, right? Like as particularly as Black students go into these post-secondary institutions, right? Like it's like you know, like what does it mean? You know, we talk a lot about the terminology around what it means to be first gen, right? Like and what it means
Mhm.
to, you know, be there like the first person in their family to go do that. It's like it's a part of what helps, right? Like is right, like there's a capital that comes along with knowledge of how, you know, to navigate like these post-secondary institutions, and what it means to, right, like get FAFSA done, and what it means to, you know, do these other things, and what it means to talk to professors, you know, right? And so a lot of times we know, right, like that, like if family members or parents have had that experience, right, it's easier to pass that information down to their student or to their children who are
Right.
current students, you know.
Yeah, and that helps with that navigational capital piece, just being able to have that ability to talk to your professors and in order to get the results you're looking for. But with so much going on with this topic, we could take it. We could just take this topic from different angles. But I'm more interested in just the language piece, and I know this
Hmm.
is something that you yourself have talked about in different presentations, make different workshops, and you're passionate about this.
Hmm.
I know just from teaching math, and I've had predominantly Black classrooms throughout my entire career,
Hmm. Hmm.
middle school. And even though I know the traditional math lingo, there are times where I can't use that to get that learning out of my kids. Sometimes I had to use some non-traditional, informal language so that they
Hmm.
can access it better. And I taught in Boston, I taught in Philly, and the
Okay.
lingo is very different in Philly. When I was in Philly, I was saying Jean a lot
All right,
because
right.
Jean is like the word. And then you go to
Exactly.
Boston, it's like on God. And on
Yeah.
dogs. Like there's these terms that are very much synonymous with different areas where black people are, and I had to find ways to incorporate that into my pedagogy
Mm,
in order for them to get connected. So I want to find out from you, just from your experience and just through the research you've done, what are those benefits of centering those linguistic identities of black students, factoring in just knowing the fact that those are different regardless of where you are, right?
mm.
How can we what's the benefit of centering those linguistic identities in your instructional and pedagogical approach?
Yeah, man, I think that's a dope question, man. Like because I think the benefit, right, like is that students start to see themselves as being inherently involved in these disciplines, right? Like I
Right.
think for so long, right? Like I think black students in particular, right, like have been like, man, we don't do math, like we don't use math. When there's so many different kind of conversations around like what mathematics is, what it isn't, and who is a part of that conversation. And I
Mhm.
think when we utilize like the linguistic identities of these students, right, we help them to see themselves within the content in and of itself, right? So part of what I think, and part of what I always try to help people to understand, right, like is that there is so much that we teach children, even that is outside of the curriculum, right? Like even like me going into a class, having a full lesson plan, and I'm teaching on this content. There's so much more that we're teaching them about themselves and during that class period than just what we have on implemented in that lesson plan, right? Like, and part of what I try to make sure that I do not teach them, right? Like it's how to disparage their own linguistic practices, right? How not to disparage the language that they utilize with their cousins, with their family members, right? Like when they utilize at church. I don't want them to ever leave my mathematics classroom thinking that there is something inferior about the ways that they communicate with their communities and the ones that they love. Right. Like, so there's never going to be a time where I tell them there's something wrong with that language. What I do in my pedagogy and what I try to focus on, right? Like, is how do we help them to understand that? And I like the way that April Becker Bell frames it, right? Like when she calls it Black language. But a lot of times you'll see a lot of the language and literacy scholars and the scholars in linguistics talk about like African American language, right? Like where some people may know the more dated Ebonics
Mhm.
or African American vernacular English. But part of what I want them to understand about Black language, right? Like, is that Black language has all the tools, right? Like, that we need them to be able to use, even within a mathematics discourse, right? Like, so that there's like Black language is not hurting for any of that. But what I want them to understand, right? Like, is that there is a language, right? Like, there's terminology, there's vocabulary that gets taken up in mathematics spaces that isn't better than the language that we use in Black language, right? Like, I just need you to understand, right? Like, how to also use that language in addition to this math language. Again, I don't want you to ever think that there's something wrong with Black language. I just need you to know that it's different from what we have, that we typically will use within mathematics environments, right? Like that they're, again, right? Like, and in the way that I kind of go about this, right? Like, so I even start with, in mathematics, right? Like we always talk about proving, right? Like proof is like one of the big, the go-tos, right? Um, and I talk about, right, like how even within the context of Black language, right, like we think about proof all the time, right? Like for a child
Sure.
to say, man, on my mama, on my hood, you know what I'm saying, right? Like they are trying
Yep.
to prove something to you, right? Like, so again, when I try to, and they typically will laugh at that, but what I always want them to understand, right, like that is that the way that we kind of teach them two column proofs, right? Like that this is one form, right? Like that people have said, right? Like this is like how we have agreed and been socialized to think about proof within this space. Again, the way that we prove in other spaces, particularly within Black language, is no less inferior. Again, this is just a different way that you're going to prove, and this is what we're focused on today. But again, I don't want you to think that there's anything wrong with the way that we prove in other ways. So that has been a big part of it. And I think part of, again, going back to that question of what are the benefits, right? Like I think they leave there knowing a little more about the language, right? Like that they use, right? Like and the beauty of the language that we use in those spaces, right? And I think um, it's so interesting to me, right? Like because I think we don't think enough about the ways that Black people love language. You know what I'm saying? This is what I always try to highlight, right? Like if
Yeah.
you think about the whole genre of hip hop, right? Like it was founded, right? Like and it's imbued with Black language. You know what I'm saying? And
Yes.
like people take
Yes.
it up all the time, and it's like, yo, like part of the reason why there's such an appeal, right? Like it's because I think there's this love for language, right? Like that we don't always highlight or we make explicit all the time. Even if we think about right, like the first um Black Nobel laureate. You know what I'm saying? I think Toni Morrison was the first the first woman as well in the U.S. But don't quote me on that just yet, y'all. But she is the first Black Nobel laureate, and she's got it like she literally uses Black language within all her novels. You know what I'm saying? Like, so how do
Yes.
we have a canon of Black literature? But then we still think about like how decadent, how inferior, how inappropriate, how wrong Black language is, right? Like there's never a time that we should be teaching children that, right? Like, and I think um again, right, like even within the context of mathematics, right? Like if we want children to be able to discuss their ideas, to engage in mathematics discourse, I'm never saying, right, like that a student, right, like these students should never know the language of coefficient. Like I need you to know what a coefficient is. I
Of
need you to know
course.
what an asymptote is, right? But as you are engaging, right, like part of what we want in math education is for students to be able to conjecture, right? Like to be able to explain their thinking, right? Like to be able to critique others' ideas. Part of what I help them to also understand is that Black language has the capacity to be able to do all of that and more. So I'll
Mm.
pause there. Like if there's anything you want me to
Yeah.
follow up on, but like that's the that's the gist of it, man. And I'll say
Yeah.
one more thing too, right? Like because I think
Yes.
Teresa Perry, right? Like she mentions this right, like in the Ebonics debate book, right? She talks about right like that language, right? Like it's like this last kind of area, this last atmosphere, right? Like that we still have a lot of Black shame around. You know what I'm saying? It's like she's like, you know, we've learned to love we've learned to love the melanin in our skin, right? Like we've learned to love our hair, but there's something about the language that it almost makes us cringe at times, right? Like there's a part of it that we still haven't learned to fully love all the way. But there's something
Mm.
so Black about the language. And I think again, for me, if I'm having students engage in mathematics, right? Like if I'm having them engage in mathematics discourse, I have to know that Black language is going to pop up in those conversations. And again, I want them to know that is valuable, that is beautiful, that is appropriate, right? Like I want them to know all of these things about the language that they use and that they're able to still be able to do mathematics within the context of that language.
Right. And I agree with everything you're saying with regard to that. But I think there's always this conflict that comes up when we have this conversation. And it's the fact that in every state in our country, we're taking standardized tests, specifically in math, that are just inherently anti-Black.
Mm,
We look at the language,
mm,
right?
mm,
And you mentioned coefficients. Like I could talk about coefficients and variables, equations and inequalities, um, sum product, all these different terms that we know in math
mm,
that are
mm,
important.
mm,
But those are the same terms that students are expected to use on these assessments,
mm,
right? And that's how they get the marks or the grades that they get on these assessments is by demonstrating how well they're able to use that language. Even though that's the formal language that they do that we use in math,
mm,
there's no space for them to show their thinking in a way that's authentic to them culturally
mm, mm,
and linguistically. And I think that's where we have to really disrupt.
mm, mm,
But that's
mm,
something that's not going to happen overnight,
right.
unfortunately.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so what do you say to that? Because I know people have brought that up.
Yeah, man. I think it points to the bigger issue of standardized testing. You know what I'm
All right.
saying? Like when we try to, I always say, and this is what I was telling my doctoral students, right? Like, is that whenever you standardize something, something else gets left out. Like, let's
True.
be clear, right? Like when we standardize things, right? Like something is going to be left out. And typically those things are things that are typically more affirming to Black people, right? Like, or that are tend to be um more situated like within Black cultural spaces, right? Like so we know that's like, and that's a part of the anti-Blackness, right? Like is how then do we also have, like, if we're talking about standardizing, how do we make something that is standardized across all of these different cultures? And I think that's the difficulty there, right? Like and I think to me that kind of points to the fact, right, like that why do we even want to standardize this, right? Like if like we're able to have conversations about these children, right? Like developing mathematically, right? Like, does it all need to occur in the same exact way? You know what I'm saying? Like we're
Mhm.
really testing part of it, right? Like is that, you know, we're testing basic such basic skills, right? Like, and I think a lot of times those very basic skills aren't always like they don't allow, particularly for Black children, right? Like to be able to show the creativity of their mathematical thinking, right? Like, or the beauty, or like the very brilliance of their mathematical thinking, right? Like, and I think the desire to be able to standardize a lot of times, like I said, like it just leaves so much out of the conversation. It leaves so much off
Mhm.
of the table, right? Like, and it forces you to say that my math, like to conform to mathematics thinking, like in a very in a very niche kind of way, right? Like it
Like
says that you're
prescribed
proficient
way, right?
only
Yeah.
if you're able to do these certain tasks or these certain procedures, right? A lot of times them kids don't be like knowing what those procedures like are outside of that standardized test. It's like, well, how then have you really cultivated some mathematics thinking and learning in these children, right? Like if it's only something that they can do on a test. And this isn't to say like it sound deficit towards these kids, right? But part like this is deficit towards the actual test, right? Like there's something
Yeah.
wrong with the test. Like to be clear. But yeah, man, like and yeah, I think we have to, and this is for part of the freedom dreaming, right? That I'm trying to do like in my work is to say, what is a better way for us to really be able to showcase, right? Like I don't think that we necessarily have to test to be able to say, right, like, man, look how brilliant these kids are, right? Like, I think so often testing and standardized tests is used to penalize. What if we really had a value for being able to display their brilliance that said, man, look how brilliant these kids are? How much of a different interpretation or framing is that than just to say, well, if you can't pass this test in this exact way, I'm going to penalize you, versus, man, let me demonstrate everything that I have learned over this semester or over this course.
You know what's crazy with regard to that? I think about some of the college courses we've taken, whether we're
Mm,
talking undergrad or even grad, post grad, whatever, right?
mm,
In some of those courses, our final assessment wasn't even a summative assessment.
mm,
It was
mm.
more so a portfolio of work.
Exactly.
Like,
Exactly.
okay, give me like 5 or 6 items you want to put in your portfolio to demonstrate that you understood everything that I taught during this semester. I don't
Exactly.
understand why we can't do that. I think that's something that we could standardize across the board.
Mm, mm.
Let's give students the autonomy to showcase their learning.
Yeah,
Okay, I want you to take 2 pieces of work that show your growth in learning,
exactly.
2 pieces of work that you know that you can improve upon, 2 pieces of work that you're most proud of, and
Mm,
explain how you've grown in this work. Explain why you're proud of this work. Explain why you need to improve in this work.
mm.
That's the critical thinking
Exactly.
that's lacking sometimes in our assessments. And I just feel like with regard to math, we can do more of that. That's going to benefit our
Exactly.
students more.
Exactly, man. Like, and to me, right, like that's much more of uh an intellectually rigorous skill than just being able to do certain procedures, right? Like that to me, that requires so much more than just factoring 10,000 equations, right? Like or 10,000 expressions. You know what I'm saying? Like after you've done two of those, I'm good. I don't need to see you do like 8,000 more. You know what I'm saying? Like, and I think that's the part that we have to get out of is that there's only one way for them to be able to showcase this brilliance. I will say this, like just because I think I can hear people responding to that, right? Like particularly, right, like practitioners, like teachers that are in the classroom. It's difficult to maybe like keep up with all those portfolios or to grade that many portfolios,
It's a
right?
little bit more work. I will
Yeah,
admit that.
and I
It's a little bit
get
more
that,
work.
right? Like, but if like you know what I'm saying, like if the case is the really just like again, how much are you really learning from them if all they're doing is standardized testing, though? You know what I'm saying? It's like if we really want to I feel like we could shift it around to say like again, right? Like this conversation, like do students need homework every night? Do students need quizzes every week? You know what I'm saying? Like, what if
Mhm.
it was like that portfolio was like you turn that portfolio in once a month? You know what I'm saying? And like that drastically reduces the amount of work that you have to grade. And it's something much more substantive than just like maybe like a standardized multiple choice quiz that they might have just guessed all the way on. You know what I'm saying? Like it's like
Exactly.
you're seeing more of the process. You're seeing them show work more. You get but yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem. We like to do things that are convenient for us as teachers. And I say that in a generalized sense, not you and me, of course, but just
Mhm.
in general. Like the way certain things are set up, it's set up in a way that's more convenient for us, but not
Mhm.
always in the best interest of our students.
Right. Right.
And standardized testing is just something that is, if not at the top of the list, near the top of that list.
Mhm.
Because listen, I'm not going to sit here and say that I love grading,
Right.
but I know it's something that is necessary for
Right.
me to understand how well my students are progressing.
Yeah.
It's something that I have to do and is necessary. And I
Yeah.
recognize that. Do I love it? No.
Right.
Do I love the lesson plan? No, I do not. But I did it every week because I knew it would get me prepared week after week. And I was a much better teacher for that.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? So sometimes we do things that we don't necessarily love to do. But guess what? Did the students benefit from you putting in that extra work? They
Yeah.
sure did.
Yeah. Indeed.
And that's what should matter at the end of it all, you know?
Mhm. Yeah.
But man, we could talk so much about that,
So
and
much.
we may have to table that for like a part two down the
Yeah.
road. But I do want to make sure that I'm respectful of your time. So just to close us out, I want to do a quick lightning round. Just have a few quick hitter questions to close out the conversation. First question is, what is your favorite math skill to teach or learn?
Oh man. Oh man, lightning. I feel like I see the time about to buzz, you know what I'm saying? Favorite thing. I will say, like, I really love. There's this way that I typically will introduce to my calculus students. Um, the reason why we have to think about the slope of the secant line to approximate the slope of the tangent line as we're talking about the derivative. I always
Sure.
use this this little meme of Jay-Z on this scooter. And so we kind of build the whole lesson around that, right? Like, because like we're talking about how fast he's going. Then the students, they kind of joning on him at first, but then we kind of build to the idea of right, like why that's a single moment in time and why it's hard to like talk about his speed in that single moment of time. And so that's probably my favorite right now.
Cool. Oh, that's dope, man. Most difficult math skill to learn or teach? Either one.
Most difficult. Hmm. I think maybe going back to particularly maybe like factoring when A is not one, you know what I'm saying? Like,
Mhm.
like when you have to like, kind of do the guess and check and you kind of pairing with the outer and the inner. I think students
Like
they
you
kind of
kind of like polynomials,
yeah, yeah,
like
yeah.
FOIL method and all that.
Yeah. So I think they want it to be immediate, right? Like, but I like the idea of saying, well, those didn't work. Now we need to try another set of factors. So I think that tends to I think part of the learning is right like that. It's not supposed to be immediate. And that's what I'm teaching them and trying to help them understand. And that tends to be difficult.
So kind of like going through the list of factor pairs. All right, let's try this factor pair. Do
Exactly.
those fit? No. Cross it out.
Exactly.
Like, nah, I feel you on that one for sure.
Yeah.
Um, is there a book you're currently reading for leisure? Not so much for research work, but
Leisure. Um, yeah, I'm actually I put it down, but I need to like I'm reading it. I'm kind of reading it just like as I go. But Jarvis Gibbons Fugitive Pedagogy.
oh yeah,
So
that's a popular one.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Have you read it?
Um, I've had people come on and talk about it,
Okay,
and
okay, okay.
living in Boston, I've actually bumped into Dr. Givens because he's at Harvard across
Yeah,
the
yeah,
river.
yeah.
So now, good brother. I still need to read it and see it for myself, but I've just heard nothing but great things about it. So yeah, that's what's up.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm trying to finish that up. I started it. I'm reading a couple pages here and there. So I'm trying to finish it.
All right, cool. And then I know you're into music, man. So I want to throw out a music question to finish us off. Give me your
Okay.
top five favorite musicians of all time.
Oh man.
No particular order. No particular
Oh
order.
man. It's funny. I start out with this little icebreaker with my students, and I ask them, but it's so hard. I feel like it changes, but I think one that really kind of helps to say who I am, um, like John P. Key, because I grew up in the church and the very much church music. Outkast because of
Oh, of
Atlanta.
course.
I love
ATL. Of
love
course.
Atlanta. Also with Atlanta, Gladys Knight, they kind of talks to my love for like the R&B, the old school. Um, Mary J. Blige, because I love the hip hop R&B. And then usually like some of like the last ones are kind of like be different sometimes, but I'm gonna stick with Atlanta again because of Monica. Like I love me some Monica too. So
Hmm.
yeah, I feel like I could add 10 more, but but
No, that's a
I'll keep it
that's a
to
pretty strong list right there. Yeah,
that.
that's pretty strong right there.
Yeah, man.
Yes. That's what's up. But listen, man, Nicholas, thank you so much for coming on, man,
Of
and
course.
sharing your story and all the work you're doing. Just for our listeners and viewers, how they can connect with you on social media.
Yeah, so Twitter is probably my best way. Just because that's my academic, that's my professional. So it's Professor PROFESSUHNAO. And yeah, you can hit me up on there. I'm there a lot. Or you have any questions for me, feel free to shoot me an email. My email being nortiz1@gsu.edu. And those are probably the best ways to just to stay in contact.
Ah, man, that's what's up. So thank you again and hope you have a good rest of the day, brother.
You too, brother. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. This was an honor. This was an honor.
Oh, man, no problem, man. Take care.
You too now.
All right. All right, y'all. So we about to go ahead and end another episode of I Dane Talk About Educators Live. And as always, wish you all good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are in the world. And we're gonna do this again another time. Peace out, y'all.